Hi, I'm Phil Howard, Director of the Center for Media, Data and Society, and it's a real pleasure today to welcome Kevan Harris to our Media and Change video series. Professor Harris works at Princeton, is in transition to UCLA. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So one of the things that's exciting about your research is that you're one of the few people who does field work in Iran on media, is able to speak and engage with people in Farsi and write your scholarship in English. Can you say a bit about the audiences you're finding for your work? Because you're sort of uniquely positioned.
I'm not the only one, and there's a growing group of younger scholars who, a generation after the 1979 revolution, have started to go back, ask new questions, and engage in field work to answer those questions as opposed to just guess at them from afar. So I think I'm maybe one of the older members of that group. That being said, I found that our work and my work is read far more widely than I expected. Obviously, those who are interested in Iran, who live in Europe or the US, tend to find me and read my work. But also Iranians themselves who are, of course, reading works of scholarship in not just Persian, but in many languages from around the world, they encounter my work, and I have all kinds of different responses, not always positive, but usually thoughtful and engaged.
One of the things that makes the Iranian Revolution and the story of modern Iran interesting for me is that it seems really difficult to tell the story of 1979 without talking about media and the cassette tapes and the poems and the prayers. And then it seems to be that for the last 20 or 30 years, the Persian diaspora has been held together by these media networks based in LA that were not actually, so managed to help keep the culture vibrant, keep the government in exile sort of connected. So the media story is written into what's changed in Iran for several decades now.
I think from an outsider's perspective, the 1979 revolution is probably the only revolution in the 20th century whose story was told by its losers, whether they were right or not. The story that we generally know was the story that they told, and some of that story was told out of the way that the diaspora formulated different narratives after the revolution in Europe and in the US and also elsewhere. Inside Iran, of course, there was the official narrative of what happened, and it also had a bit of whitewashing and erasing of the broad coalition that emerged in the process of the revolution itself. However, because the 1979 revolution was a huge popular mobilizational process, as much as the state that came out of it attempted, it couldn't really clamp down on all forms of cultural production. Some it sponsored, but some, of course, existed on the sidelines. Even at the peak of, let's say, the 1980s to 88 Iran-Iraq war, there was official cultural production. There was also cultural production on the side.
Especially through film.
Through film and through novels. There's a huge explosion in novels, including novels by women in Iran. After the war ended in the 1990s, this sort of nascent and inchoate cultural production, both official, semi-official, and private, burst into a new public sphere in Iran. And that's where the diaspora reconnected with those inside Iran. And at first, arguably, those who had lived outside of Iran sort of held that what they were doing was more important, and that the stories they were telling about Iran, including very nationalist stories about Iranian history, were being lost inside Iran. They needed to be recaptured. But slowly, that balance, I think, partly through generational change, and partly just through the sheer volume of things that had been happening in Iran, began to tilt. And I remember a well-known pop song in Iran that came out when I was living there in 2009, and it was called Iruni in LA, and it was by a rap group in Tehran who was parodying Iranians in LA about how they were obsessed with iPhones and obsessed with things like that. And for me, it was a symbol of a tipping point where cultural producers in Iran were actually able to satirize the diaspora, as opposed to about a whole generation where they were lionizing them. And now I think there's a much more equal balance now inside and outside Iran.
Interesting. I think Iran may be unique in that it's got such a huge cohort of young people to consume that content. And to me, I would guess that there's some distance between what the mullahs value and imagine as being useful cultural production and what people under 14 actually consume, right? How big is that gulf?
There's always generational gulfs. I think one has to be a bit careful about seeing youth as a homogenous and monolithic actor, including an actor that is a force of change in and of itself. I know it's something that we all talk about, and of course, as I get older, I'm more skeptical of it. But it's specifically because the generation, the young generation in Iran, which is now getting older, Iran is no longer a young society; it's an aging society because the birth rate has declined so greatly. So this generation is divided. It has cleavages that some of them repeat the cleavages of a previous generation, whether by class or by ethnicity or by province or by education. But there's also new cleavages within Iranian society that didn't even exist a generation ago. And some of this
are those internet-based cleavages? Or is this a technology use story?
One always has to be careful about mapping internet and the media cleavages directly onto social cleavages because the media has its own autonomous properties. However, you can see, just like in other countries, that media becomes an echo chamber. So the circulation and production of social facts that might not be correct, but they're taken for granted and believed in among wide groups of society, it happens in Iran through the production of media and the consumption of it online. And you might think, and one could hope, that the sort of entry of new people into this conversation would act as a check, either by sort of the state line or official propaganda, or on the more outlandish things that you hear, on the periphery. And of course, that does happen, but the opposite can happen too. That sort of echo chambers online can reify a sort of way of seeing a particular thing going on in Iran when the rest of society or other parts of society see it differently. And then those narratives can clash as opposed to, debate in this deliberative format that we thought, social media would be a platform for.
It's interesting you mentioned the mapping, because in some of those mapping studies about the Chinese blogosphere, Chinese internet, the Russian blogosphere, the Russian internet, and the Persian one, one of the things I think that makes the Persian internet map sphere unique is the boundedness of course, language use, but also the degree to which the government produces content for young people. And there's these stories of the Basiji militias blogging or being trained to blog at least, and the huge volumes of poetry that go online, and supposedly consultations with mullahs who are not your community-based mullahs or mullahs based in London, based in LA. So there's supposed to be quite a vibrant internet sphere, right? For maybe it's the under 25 crowd. If it's not under 14.
It is probably people coming into the Middle Ages. So I think in the 1990s, when there was a sort of big push for democratization in Iran, many new entrants into the political sphere, and then as well in the media sphere, I think we read that from the outside as this was one side pushing and for making change. But this is where the generational cleavages are actually important. By the end of the 1990s, you also had a sort of, if you want to call it, a new right-wing populist culture, which may have had, of course, a space that the state created for it, but was actually producing a lot of content autonomously.
And I'm sorry, this is the nationalist culture that defends the right to nuclear.
It's not it's not a single. It's not an issue-based culture. It's often about venerating the Iran-Iraq War. Okay. It's a sort of often defending the state, even when the state itself doesn't need to be defended, and a lot of young people actually engage in that. So there was, if you want to call it, I wouldn't call it autonomous, but I would call it sort of still independently produced culture that was being carried out by people who weren't opposed to the state, and already by the late 1990s you could see that, and that produced again a sphere where new social facts are made that clashed with the sort of more with the more liberal groups that were also heavily active in media. I think we tend to look only at the groups that we sympathize with or that we identify with, and so the point of mapping the Persian blogosphere, or now the Persian language sites, is that you actually get a good read on how much activity is going on all sides, and to kind of claim that one side is independent and autonomous and critically thinking, the other side is just totally tied to the state, in the hands of the state. It's probably a bit facile reading of all the activity going on. And instead, I think what it is it actually, maybe on one side, it's a lot of work being put in, and it looks like nothing's changing, but it's actually a lot of work to carefully cultivate new ways of talking about politics. And on the other side, it's a lot of agitation and a lot of activity, but actually it's still part of this broader conversation. I mean, they're still reacting to each other, and there's a relational element, even though it might seem like they're isolated and in their own groups.
Okay. So I hear you saying that there's more diversity than most of us appreciate in political discourse online, certainly in Iran. Would you say that these different groups are united against censorship, formal censorship? Iran is supposed to be one of the few countries with a fully operational kill switch, right? They regularly do deep packet inspection on everything that enters the country. I think China's tried it and Russia can't afford it, and so we know where these deep packet inspection technologies end up. Would these diverse groups in Iran oppose censorship, or actually some of them see censorship as a cultural protection?
Right. I think that's so. There's most of the people who would defend it obviously wouldn't call it censorship. They would frame it in claims along claims of protecting, national values. The same kind of thing that you hear from Christian democracy parties in Europe, often on the issue of being allowed in who can have access to what content. So they would see it as a question of degree, but you do, of course, have libertarian movements, information libertarians in Iran, to put it bluntly, who want radically free access to all information. To a certain extent, as distribution technology becomes more available, that question, it's not moot, let's put it that way. But as somebody who personally has just distributed proxy technology to people I've met in Iran who were asking, who wanted the latest version of something, I would just give it to them. I think that's where the
leakage, technology
leakage and incremental change occurs. Yeah. Incremental change occurs.
But it's always so hard to measure how many people in Russia, in China, or Iran can actually work around a firewall. Sure. What would be could you guess? Have you seen numbers? What percentage of the population actually can run a Tor server search?
I think there's an even larger issue here, which is that, quantitative data on internet penetration in the Middle East is often taken as a proxy for, you name it. Civil society, modernization, sort of westernization, whatever proxy you want to call it. But the problem is that you're going from a qualitative social structure and a set of networks to a quantitative indicator. So, for example, even in 2009, in the 2009 protests known as the Green Movement in Iran, internet penetration rates were often claimed to be 50%. But about half, or maybe 60% of those were people who accessed, according to the surveys, accessed the internet on their phone at least once a month. Now, I was in Iran in 2009. I had not the most advanced phone, but I know those who did. And this is not like you're sitting on your iPhone reading internet and reading subversive sites on your phone. It's basically maybe accessing your bank account once a month.
Got it.
So internet penetration rates were highly overestimated, especially if we're thinking that people have access to DSL and broadband, who could then run at the speeds to use proxy software efficiently. As someone who used them in 2009, when supposedly the internet was such a driving force of political conversation, I can say that, and I wasn't living in northern Tehran at the time, I was living in the other part of the city, and I tried to access the internet on these heavy days of heavy traffic and slow traffic, and I can tell you that no conversations were being had, at least no back and forth conversations. It was very different. So, of course, through time, that's changing. In fact, we probably project backwards of what we experience today in terms of internet technology. But of course, what happened later in other parts of the Middle East might be a different story. On the other hand, it doesn't take too many people to use the internet.
And if it's the leader, if the civil opinion leaders or whatever. Right. So I think you're right about the way that internet penetration data serves as a proxy for many things. Some of us who study technology diffusion and social change imagine that the internet data is actually a proxy for SMS contact. So sure, not very few people are using Twitter, but it's the best data that's a proxy for what people are actually doing, which is texting each other. Sure. And the texting one is academics will never get the national SMS records to be able to do the network maps necessary, but it may be that texting is still about networks between family and friends and spreading jokes and spreading humor and spreading logistics info about protests. Is that a better proxy for Iran's internet data?
It is. It probably has less revolutionary implications, though, given that, I mean, the amount of information that you can send to someone. So I think on the days, I mean, to take 2009, which is so symbolic for different people for different reasons in terms of the media and politics. Okay, so there were days in which certainly sort of SMS cues were given and spread widely to about when particular protests were going to happen on particular days. On the other hand, landline was used often too. I mean, the landline, which worked far better, by the way, at the time than SMS communication, also was a way in which people communicated, calling each other in the morning and asking where the protest was that day. And in fact, I personally witnessed, the landline option worked better than the SMS option. And the two subsequent days, I went to a protest where, let's say that there was less discussion on where it was supposed to be, and everybody kind of agreed. And I learned about it through landline actually. And then a few days later, both on the internet and through SMS, I was seeing calls for the protest in all different parts of Tehran, different squares. So I showed up to one of them, and just like me, thousands of people showed up, and it turned out to be the wrong site.
Now, would that because the regime was doing the honeypot thing?
No, it was because the information technology itself was fragmenting as opposed to consolidating. I mean, since there's no leader, how do I know if call in square A is correct versus B? And we kind of guessed, and from there, my guess was wrong. And then by the time we got over to square A, it was already fragmented enough to basically have lost its mobilizational sort of power. And maybe that is a problem that is temporary and can be solved through time. But I think that without brokers on the ground, I mean, that's my real feeling about the relationship between media use and politics, is that brokers on the ground matter. So you can create narratives online. You can even call for movements online. But the way in which that manifests itself in society really requires individual brokers or organizational brokers. So for example, you could have protests in Tehran all you wanted, and then online activists, whether inside or outside Iran, would say, let's have the same protests with the same symbols and the same slogans in other cities in Tehran, because that's what occurred, and yet those protests barely manifested themselves.
But I'm sorry, but in that summer of 2009, wasn't there the local broker in Mossavar? I mean, he had just lost an election, and his Green Party had a great Facebook page, I suppose, that was coordinating people, and
certainly the sort of him and the whole sort of political organizational structure of the opposition was taken out of the picture, which is why, of course, the mobilization was so surprising. Here you had, a relatively stable and recurring political process in Iran, where you had, sort of parties or pseudo-parties on both sides which mobilized voters. And then in 2009, you had one side of it just basically taken out the day of or the day after the election. And yet then the protests swelled. So that's the real mystery, is without an organizational base, you had a huge mobilizational wave. But it did peak quite early. And then it began to demobilize. And as someone who was there during that time, I saw from the outside it looked like it was all just smooth and organic. But inside, organizationally, it was a mess, and it never got on its feet, and so
it never got its own.
Well, I mean, again, and of course, some people celebrate that. Some people say we don't need leaders, we don't need organizations, but I mean, it was not just Iran. Look at all the other movements that have happened since 2008 around the world, where at the time the lack of a structure was celebrated. As things are mobilizing, it always looks like that's working, but then once movements start to demobilize, people started to lament the fact that there's nobody in charge.
And when you get close to an election, if they get around to calling an election, the social networks aren't parties, right? You still ultimately need to have some
That's where Iran differs from, I would say, other Arab states. Like, when Egypt has an election, turnout is low and 90% vote for Mubarak, and there's not really a chance that anything's going to happen. I mean, even in the small time when the Muslim Brotherhood did well, that was a big shock, and they made sure that wouldn't happen again. Okay, so in Iran, I mean, no one really knows if the election's going to result in something good or bad, depending on who you're voting for. So, 2013. I mean, to a large extent, 2013, where the Hassan Rouhani won the presidential election against 4 conservative candidates, all of whom many thought had the best chance because of the unequal structures of competition in Iran's politics. And yet Rouhani won just barely with 50% of the vote. And as I was also there during that time, and I could see that it wasn't just the normal structures of mobilization of politics in Iran that was helping that. It was also building off of the networks that had formed in 2009 and then lay dormant. So to a certain extent, the Green Movement may have lost whatever their goals might have been
brand, right?
As a brand, but the networks that were made, including networks online, that lay dormant in 2013. They helped, and the activists helped, battle-hardened activists, I would say, helped to craft a narrative not for the overthrow of the state, but for the channeling of this mobilization into an electoral process, which produced such a surprising outcome, and then led to, negotiations with the West and all of the changes that we're seeing today. So, in that sense, again, social media and media communication require brokers that, because media is social, politics is social. So in 2009, you had brokers who were actively pushing in one direction, and in 2013, including some of the very same people, were pushing in a different direction and led towards channeling it into an electoral process.
That suggests that if there's a possibility of regime change, it might happen through elections. Right? Regime change, it depends what they mean by regime. But let's say a sort of push for opening up of the system to new entrants, to sort of expanding social and economic rights. Most of the people, including many of the people who suffered in 2009, it was a politically maturing process. And the sort of politics of boycott and maybe moral purity, which we saw in Iran as well as in lots of other parts of the world, when a question of an election came up, a lot of those people, some of them have become bitter and they want to sit out the process, and one can't blame them. But others have said, you know what, as long as there's space to act, we're going to take advantage of that, even if we're in, we have almost no chance. But as long as there's a chance, we want to take part in the political process, because a political process is a process. And to believe that actually makes it true to a certain extent. Well, it seems to be a process that the mullahs abide by. They haven't fiddled too much with it. Did the lights go out in Tehran for all the computer power go out for a night in Tehran in the last election?
No.
None of those stories emerged?
None of those, a lot of the stories one hears about elections in Iran that circulate through social media tend to, of course, be exaggerations or false. And to a certain extent, that's why people like myself need to go and just do a little bit of a litmus test. So I went and voted in the election in 2013 just to see what it was like. So I heard so many stories about voting. If you don't vote, you can't go to school. If you don't vote, they don't let you go to Turkey for your vacation, or Syria or Malaysia or wherever. And I found voting in Iran to be like a amazingly like Wild West, but still rather democratic process in 2013, of course, where there was a pretty healthy discussion of candidates, and because the electoral cycle in Iran is so compressed. Compressed compared to maybe the United States or a few European countries, but not compressed compared to South Africa, where also elections are very compressed. It really makes for surprises and high mobilizational energy. And so, the thing about political elites in Iran is that on the one hand, they really don't like it, but they're forced to engage with and try to channel this mobilizational energy to their side. But political elites in Iran are divided more than just into two camps, but in numerous camps. So that's where politics matters, as opposed to just a sort of lump of youth, some kind of online media sphere in and of itself that acts.
And the diaspora.
And the diaspora. Okay, these things are all important for setting the tone and creating the narratives, but then the political process itself is a process, and that's where outcomes are determined.
Interesting. So what's transportable? For somebody who's nominally interested in Iran, are there things we can learn about what's gone on, say, since 2009 that would help us understand other, I'll say authoritarian, maybe that's not the right word, but China or Cuba, perhaps, or Venezuela or Russia, other countries where the networked authoritarian countries, right? That's one of the buzz phrases we use.
Right. So I think that we need to move away from a sort of very abstract, maybe regime-level characterization of system types when it comes to media activity. Also move away from the very micro-level analysis of where if someone is rebelling online, that can be generalized to a whole sort of ecosystem of incipient revolution. Instead, we really need to move to the middle, from the very abstract to the very micro to the middle, and look at how these conversations are structured in relation to each other. So kind of what I said about, sort of right, left, liberal, authoritarian blogosphere in Iran. I think you can take that relational position of understanding when people make a claim, online about a particular political subject, they're making that in relation to a conversation that's ongoing. So for someone from the outside to sort of slice that in time and look at it as a static sort of political claim, they're actually missing out on the dynamism of the conversation and on the sort of history of it, where political actors themselves, I stress political, they know actually the stakes of the game, if you will, and the relational position. So when they say something, they're really doing it to either provoke or to bring in other people who are engaged in this relational conversation. And in that sense, maybe the sort of regime type analysis where I'm going to make authoritarian countries have a particular type of media structure or media conversation versus others, that actually might hide the common ways in which political conversations occur.
Well, they're similar, aren't they, in that these are all countries that are trying to build their own internet. China is, I think, ostensibly doing it through hardware and quite successfully. Russia is doing it through probably cultural production and the national myths. And my impression was that Iran was investing significant money in hardware and language and cultural production.
Right. I mean,
so the investment strategies are similar, aren't they?
There's been a long talk and little walk for this thing that's called sort of a national internet or even a national intranet in Iran. And I mean, of course, for media heads, it was a very sexy subject that somehow Iran could create this hermetically sealed, internet that stops at the borders, and then everybody just participates in that. I think, as much as they've tried, it's been a failure, but I don't think it actually manifested itself in the ways that it was portrayed. You have, is Facebook a national internet? In a way, Facebook's also a hermetically sealed container.
Right?
Yeah, so we probably will see things like that come up in Iran. Whether that could be, projected as a really closed off and state-controlled body is another subject. It actually one that requires research. People could die. You can get in and get an account if you want.
Reason to make a career.
They don't really, but these things don't exist right now in as much as we think they do. Instead, I know that they just forced all the banks in Iran to go on an intra-banking structure, but that's because they want to protect banks from many players in the world economy who might have an interest in knowing what's going on. Yeah. So, and in fact, that's probably a better use of their time, than railing against cultural invasion.
So, last question: there's this saying that there's more Azeris in Iran than there are in Azerbaijan.
You're looking at one.
Yeah. Okay, I'm looking at one. So, Azeri identity online, is it blossoming? Is there a space for? You mentioned earlier about some of the racial ethnic diversity, some of the ethnic diversity in Iran. And Azeris must be the largest group. Are they active politically in a way they weren't 10 years ago? Or?
Yes, but not in the ways that we recognize as a distinct group. So both Ali Khamenei, the leader of Iran, and Mir Hossein Mousavi, the ostensible opposition leader of the Green Movement, are Turks. They have Turkish, background. So they're Iranian Turks, and yet both are at the pinnacle of the political system in Iran. The Islamic Republic did absorb and create sort of new pathways for mobility, like a lot of revolutions do, for people from the periphery of society. And so a lot of different ethnic groups, some formed an identity in distinction to the newly forming state, but whether that was cohesive in and of itself is a separate question. Frankly, we just don't know. Most of what we know about ethnic politics in Iran comes from diaspora ethnic movements who, there has to be the other side of the story, and we don't have the other side of the story. As far as Turks go in Iran, they're the most integrated. That's probably because they're the wealthiest. Northern Iran has always been a site of wealth, whether through agriculture or industry. It was, of course, the closest to the Ottoman Empire, closest to Russia. It was politically active for most of the late 19th to 20th century. So to think that part of the country could be totally excluded is a big question. Instead, I think it was highly integrated after the revolution. Other parts of Iran, which have historically been in the periphery, are a separate question, whether we're talking about Arabs in the south or Baluchis in the southeast. But even there, the ways in which people moved upwards through either education, through the Persianizing of their region, meaning that they spoke both their own language as well as Persian, or how they moved into politics through the center and then back out to their own provinces. That's a story that we don't know much about because it's a story that needs to be uncovered. So frankly, it's a wide open sphere of sort of ethnic and linguistic politics after the revolution.
Great. Thank you very much. My guest today has been Kevan Harris. Thank you for a great conversation.
Thanks.